The Texan desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road. The heat shimmered off the asphalt like a trembling curtain, distorting the view in the distance. On the side of the road, isolated among rusty gas stations and abandoned trailers, stood the truck stop El Último Refugio, the last refuge. It was a place where travelers stopped to refuel, drink weak coffee, and if hunger struck, risk a reheated hamburger. At that hour, the only voices breaking the hum of the fans were those of three men sitting on the outdoor terrace. They had visible tattoos on their necks and forearms, thick chains and tight-fitting shirts with aggressive prints. They spoke loudly, with the mocking tone of someone who knows they are untouchable. One of them, nicknamed El Gato, the cat, was especially loud. He always laughed too hard, as if the world were his personal circus. "Look at that old geezer," he pointed with his chin towards the entrance of the place. "Did he get lost from the nursing home or what?" A white-haired man, thin but straight as a post, had just crossed the threshold of the restaurant. He wore a button-down shirt, worn jeans, and carefully polished military boots. His face, furrowed with deep wrinkles, conveyed serenity. He walked with deliberate slowness, as if time did not press him. "Weird old guy," added another of the group. "Culebra?" "Snake," as he dropped his cigarette butt on the ground. "Looks like he used to be military, but one of those who only clean boots." Inside the place, the waitress looked up and offered a friendly smile to the newcomer. "The usual Don Mateo." He nodded with a slight movement of his head and occupied the same corner table next to the window. From there he observed without haste, as if every detail had value. The old paintings on the wall, the jukebox that nobody used anymore, the coming and going of the truckers. Don Mateo didn't talk much. In fact, nobody in the area knew too much about him. They had seen him arrive a few months ago, on a Harley-Davidson as old as him, and since then he appeared there every Wednesday, always punctual, always alone. He had no apparent family, no friends, no cell phone, only a deep gaze and a disturbing peace. But that day something changed. The three men outside entered with a defiant air, as if they owned the place. El Gato stopped next to Don Mateo's table and looked at him brazenly. "What's up, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" Mateo looked at him briefly, not with fear, nor with anger, only with a patience so heavy that it was unsettling. Then, without saying a word, he turned his gaze back to the window. The silence that indifference left was like an invisible slap. El Gato, stung in his pride, let out a laugh that sounded forced. "Wow, looks like we have a monk here. What do you think, Culebra? Should we say an Our Father for him?" The waitress approached, nervous, trying to calm things down. "Leave him alone, please. He just wants to eat in peace." But it was too late. Something in that look of Don Mateo had touched a sensitive nerve. It wasn't contempt. It was something worse. Absolute disinterest. "Maybe you want us to keep you company, old man," said the third, nicknamed Tigre, Tiger, "just in case you choke on your hamburger." Mateo did not respond. He just took the knife to cut the bread, and with an almost ritual tranquility, slid it between his fingers, gauging the edge like someone remembering something they haven't completely forgotten. At that moment, the air seemed to become denser. The atmosphere of the place changed subtly. Nobody understood why, but even the customers who were eating lowered their voices, as if an invisible storm was about to break. Outside, the wind raised a cloud of dust that covered the horizon. The story had only just begun. The tension in El Último Refugio did not dissipate after Don Mateo's silence. On the contrary, it lingered in the air like the stale smoke from the cigarettes that the three men smoked with arrogance. El Gato was not used to being ignored. His life had been a constant parade of forced submission, threats, blows, shouts, and fear. It was his language, but that old man with his serene face and his firm hands spoke another dialect, one that did not fear. "Old piece of shit," he muttered through clenched teeth as he left the place with his two companions behind. The waitress, still trembling, approached Mateo with a pitcher of freshly made coffee. "You shouldn't have provoked them. They're not good people. They come from Mexico. They call themselves Los Perros del Desierto, the desert dogs." They say they work for a cartel, although nobody knows which one. Matteo looked at her. His eyes were grey, almost metallic. If they bark, they don't bite, he replied in a low voice, and then added without emotion, but if they bite, you have to be ready. The young woman didn't know what to say. She returned to the counter, bewildered. Over the years, she had seen hundreds of truckers, vagabonds, crazy people, even fugitives pass through. But that old man, he had something different. It wasn't just his military posture or his way of looking without blinking. It was the feeling that he had lived more than anyone could imagine, as if his bones held secrets that no confessional could absorb. In the gravel parking lot behind the restaurant, the three men lit a cigar each and sat in the back of their black pickup truck. El Gato chewed a toothpick furiously. "That guy gave me the creeps," said Culebra, taking off his sunglasses. "What if he's from some rival group?" "A rival group with diapers?" Tigre laughed, although the laugh was not as convincing as usual. El Gato gave a dry look to his two sidekicks. "It doesn't matter who he is. Nobody makes fun of me. Tomorrow we're going to follow him. I want to know where that old geezer lives. And if it turns out he's not who he says he isn't, well, you know what we do." Night fell on the desert like a blanket of dense shadows. Crickets chirped among the dry bushes, and the distant howl of a coyote broke the silence from time to time. Matteo had finished his dinner and was slowly heading towards his motorcycle. The Harley waited patiently, as if it also had memory. Before getting on, he glanced at the three men leaning against their vehicle, watching him. He said nothing. He just looked at them. A look that neither challenged nor fled. A look that accepted fate with the same calm with which one serves a last cup of coffee before dawn. He started the engine. The old and powerful roar of the machine resonated like an echo from another era. And then he left. None of the three spoke for several seconds. "Did you see that?" Tigre finally said. "That guy? He's not normal." El Gato spat on the ground. "Of course he's not, but that doesn't make him invincible. Tomorrow we'll know who he is, and if he has debts to pay, we're going to collect them." The next morning, the black pickup truck started early. The desert dogs followed the route they knew Matteo took every Wednesday. They had seen him do it at least half a dozen times. He would leave the restaurant, take State Highway 93 north, and disappear among the side roads. What they didn't know was that that routine was not accidental. Matteo had designed it with precision. Every curve, every detour, every brief stop at some old gas station was part of a pattern that seemed to repeat itself, but in reality, it concealed his trail. Even so, that day he made a slip. He stopped at a supply store on the outskirts of Alpine, and that's when El Gato thought he had an opportunity. "We got him," he said with a twisted smile. "Let's follow him closely. And if he makes one more stop, we'll grab him alone." But Matteo, from inside the store, had already noticed the reflection of the pickup truck's windshield. His intuition did not deceive him. It wasn't the first time he had been followed. And if they provoked him again, it wouldn't be the first time someone would regret doing it either. The road snaked between dry hills, decorated with tall cacti and red stones that shone under the sun. Don Matteo moved at a constant speed, as if he had no hurry or fixed destination. However, every kilometer he traveled was carefully measured. It was not a simple escape. It was a calculated dance, a routine he had learned on another continent in another time with other names. In the distance, the three men followed him from their pickup truck. El Gato drove with his knuckles tense on the steering wheel. Culebra leaned on the door, spying with pocket binoculars, while Tigre documented everything with his cell phone, as if it were another trophy. "This guy doesn't do anything weird," Culebra muttered. "He just drives and drives and stops to buy water. Or he's playing with us," Tigre added. "Or he's alone, and that makes him easy to break," El Gato concluded, as his tongue clicked with contempt. Halfway along the road, Matteo turned off towards an old abandoned train station. The place, made of decaying wood and old graffiti, seemed taken from a nightmare postcard. He stopped, turned off the motorcycle and entered calmly, letting the wind close the door behind him. From the pickup truck, the three men watched in silence. "What's he doing in there?" Tigre asked. Maybe he's hiding something. Let's go see, El Gato ordered. They got out of the vehicle cautiously. Armed with knives and a defiant attitude, they advanced between creaking planks and echoes of soles hitting the wood. But upon entering, they did not find Matteo. Only dust, silence, and an old notebook open on a table. Culebra approached and leafed through it distrustfully. The pages were filled with tight writing in English and Spanish. They were reports, maps, dates, names. But the most disturbing thing was at the end, a black and white photo of a young man with a stern look and a military uniform. In the lower corner, written in blue ink, a name, Matteo Acosta, Captain of Black Operations, 1983, Colombia. "Is this real?" Tigre whispered. El Gato crumpled the photo between his fingers. "An old story, the kind that ends in the desert with a shovel. Let's go." As they left, they did not see the figure watching them from the roof. Matteo, motionless as a shadow gargoyle, contemplated them with narrowed eyes. The backpack hanging from his shoulder had more than just memories. Inside, each compartment was organized as in times of war. As evening arrived, the pursuit continued. Matteo did not accelerate or vary the path. It was as if he were inviting them to follow him, like an old wolf guiding young dogs towards their own trap. They crossed a mountainous area with no cell phone coverage and then ventured onto a secondary road where there were no longer any signs or houses, only silence. The three men began to feel uncomfortable. "Doesn't it seem strange to you that this guy hasn't tried to hide?" Tigre asked. "Maybe he doesn't care that we're following him," Culebra replied, now with less certainty in his voice. "Or maybe he's waiting for us," El Gato added with a half-smile. But in the depths of his eyes, there was a spark of doubt. For the first time, he began to suspect that that old man was not just an eccentric old man. He was someone who had learned to move with the patience of the desert and the precision of solitary predators, and they were following him into his territory. At nightfall, Matteo stopped near a wooden cabin lost in the desert, without electricity or modern signs. He got off the motorcycle, entered without haste and lit a gas lamp. Outside, the desert dogs watched from the darkness. "Do we go in tonight?" Culebra asked. "No. Tomorrow at dawn," El Gato said, "when old men haven't woken up yet." Tigre said nothing. He looked at the house strangely. Something about that place, in its solitude, in its disposition, it didn't seem improvised. It was as if everything had been set up in advance. And they were right. Matteo did not improvise. Matteo never improvised. Dawn began to paint the horizon dark blue when the three men woke up inside the pickup truck. They had slept in shifts, but no one really rested. The cabin was still there, solitary, with its gas lamp flickering like a sick beacon. Not a cricket could be heard. The air seemed suspended as if the desert were holding its breath. "It's now or never," said El Gato, putting on his leather jacket. "This old man won't even know what day it is." "What if he has a weapon?" Tigre asked. "Then better. That gives us an excuse to shut him up forever," Culebra snorted, pulling a metal chain from the back seat. They walked silently among the dry bushes. The dust crunched under their boots. They approached the house from 3 different angles, as they had done other times in ambushes for the cartel. It was a game they knew well, but this time they were not the ones who had prepared it. Inside the cabin, Matteo had been awake long before. Sitting in a wooden chair, dressed in his old military jacket, he held a rosary of black beads in his hands. His lips moved silently, reciting prayers that only he understood at that moment. On the wall in front of him hung a framed portrait. A group of smiling soldiers, all dressed in camouflage with the flag of Colombia behind. Most were dead, killed in ambushes, betrayed, forgotten. But Matteo remembered them every morning. When he heard the crackling of the nearest bush, he did not get up. He just closed the rosary with a firm knot and put it in his pocket. The moment had arrived. Tigre was the first to approach the back door. He pushed it stealthily and found it ajar. Inside, everything was silent. An old stove, a table with a cup of coffee still steaming, and a radio turned off. There was no sign of the old man. "It's empty," he whispered into his intercom earpiece. "I don't see him from the side window either. Culebra added. "But there are footprints in the dirt." "He's close." El Gato, for his part, had sneaked in through the front door. Every step he took on the floorboards sounded like a whisper in the middle of a cemetery. He stopped in the main room and looked around. There was no noise. There were no signs. Only a folded note on the table written in firm handwriting. "He who seeks violence ends up finding his own shadow." Before he could react, the radio on the shelf suddenly turned on, playing an old instrumental song filled with soft trumpets and slow drums. At the same time, a smoke grenade exploded under the back window. Tigre screamed and backed away, colliding with the door. Culebra fell to the ground, coughing in the thick haze. El Gato tried to pull out his pistol, but it was too late. From the shadows, Mateo appeared like a spectre. Without running, without shouting, only moving with the precision of someone who had trained 1,000 times for that moment. A chokehold on Tigre, a dry knee to Culebra's leg, and an elbow strike to El Gato's face. It all happened in less than 20 seconds. They didn't see it coming. The three of them were now on the ground, disoriented with their hands tied with black tape. Mateo moved among them without saying a word, checking that they had no hidden weapons. He did it like someone checking old tools before throwing them away. Who are you?" Tigre asked, his eyes wide with fear. Mateo crouched down in front of him. He took out the crumpled photo they had found in the abandoned station from his jacket. "I am the shadow of those who forget to look back." No one knew what to answer. Outside, the sky was already turning orange. But inside that cabin, the real dawn had not yet begun. Mateo knew this wasn't the end. It was just the first move in a much longer game, and a dangerous one. The black tape that bound the three men's wrists began to cut off Tigre's circulation. He squirmed uncomfortably on the dusty floor of the cabin, his cheek pressed against a splintered board. Beside him, Culebra breathed with difficulty, still dizzy from the gas, while El Gato stared fixedly at Mateo, swallowing his pride like someone drinking poison with gritted teeth. "Are you going to kill us?" El Gato finally spat out, his mouth dry. "Is that it?" Mateo didn't answer. There was neither hatred nor pleasure on his face, only calm. The old man got up with a slight sigh and walked to an old bookshelf. From a metal box, he took out a bottle of water and threw it to Tigre. "Drink." His voice was firm but without cruelty. Tigre, trembling, took the bottle with shaky hands. The water tasted like salvation. "What do you want from us?" Culebra asked, barely audible. Mateo sat down again, this time in front of them, like a teacher in front of his most inept students. "You think you're predators," he began to say in a serene voice. "But you're just dogs off the leash. You don't know what war is. You don't know the weight of pulling a trigger, knowing that that shot will change an entire country. You just play." The silence became uncomfortable. Not even the crickets outside dared to interrupt. "I was in Medellin in '83, he continued. "I saw things that not even your nightmares dare to invent. I served governments that deny my existence. I obeyed orders that broke men stronger than you. And when the world got tired of me, I hid in this desert. Not to run away, but to rest." The three men looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. They had heard stories of retired hitmen, of ex-military men who had lost their minds, but nothing had prepared them for this. Mateo wasn't crazy. He was a vestige of an era they didn't even understand. "I don't want to kill you," he added, crossing his arms, "but I need you to understand something." He got up again, went to a toolbox in the back, and took out 3 manila envelopes, one for each of them. He dropped them in front of them. "Inside are your real names, your addresses, the names of your mothers, sisters, girlfriends, even the fake license plates you used to cross the border." El Gato opened his with his teeth, his hands still tied. His face became distorted as he read. How did you get all this?" Mateo looked at him with an icy intensity. "It's not difficult to find someone who doesn't know how to hide." Tigre was already crying silently. Culebra gritted his teeth. "What do you want us to do?" he said, surrendering. Mateo walked slowly to the fireplace and took his jacket. He took a small recorder from a pocket. "You're going to record a message for your bosses, for the cartel. You'll tell them that you've retired. that I'm not worth it, that I'm a worthless old man, and that if anyone else comes looking for me, but this time it won't be envelopes, it will be coffins. El Gato wanted to resist, but one look from Mateo was enough for him to know that he had no choice. The recorder was passed from hand to hand. Each one spoke. They stammered, sweated, hesitated, but they did it. Mateo didn't say whether he would send it or not. He just turned off the device and put it away. Then, in an act that surprised everyone, he cut their ties and set them free. You have 20 minutes to get out of the desert. After that, I stop being the nice old man from the truck stop. The three stumbled out without saying a word. The black pickup truck started up in a cloud of dust. Mateo stood there, looking at the horizon. He knew it wouldn't be the last challenge. His instinct screamed that something was coming, something worse. Because the real enemies were never the ones who barked first, and the desert still had scores to settle. The following days brought a dense silence to the desert. Mateo continued with his routine: visits to El Ultimo Refugio, walks at dawn, repairs to the old Harley. To anyone watching him from afar, he seemed like a lonely old man who had found peace. But inside, the veteran didn't sleep the same. His body knew what his mind didn't want to admit. The calm that surrounded him wasn't real. It was the held breath of a storm still invisible. At his table in the restaurant, the waitress refilled his coffee without asking. "Everything all right, Don Mateo?" "Everything as it should be," he replied, but his eyes didn't match his voice. That night, he turned on the shortwave radio he had in the cabin. An old habit, a vestige of his years as an operator in areas without satellite communication. And there, in the midst of the murmur of crossed frequencies, he caught something, a fragment of a coded conversation. It wasn't clear, but he recognized the words North, active, and a code name, Phantasma, Phantom. His heart beat hard once more. That was his old name in the records that never existed. No one should remember it, no one. Hundreds of miles away on the border with Chihuahua, a man watched a board full of photographs. He was tall, thin, with an expressionless face. He dressed like any civilian, but his gaze had the emptiness of someone who has killed too much. They called him Vega, and he was in charge of cleaning up mistakes for a cell of the cartel that didn't appear in the newspapers. He was the last resort when the dogs failed. In the center of the board, a crumpled photo, Mateo at the truck stop, holding a cup, taken by Tigre days before disappearing. "I want to know what went wrong," Vega ordered his assistant. "And I want that old man breathing, only if he can talk to me. If not, he can shut up forever." The black pickup truck appeared 3 days later, abandoned on the side of the road, with no signs of violence, but completely empty. El Gato, Tigre, and Culebra had not returned to their contacts. It was as if the earth had swallowed them. Vega arrived in the area in a gray Suburban without plates. He spoke with the local police, with restaurant employees, with gas station attendants, but he didn't ask obvious questions. He just observed. When he entered El Ultimo Refugio, Mateo already knew who he was. "Table for one?" the waitress asked. Vega shook his head and went straight to Mateo, who was still reading an old newspaper. "Are you Mateo Acosta?" he asked bluntly. Mateo looked at him briefly. "Depends who's asking. Someone who doesn't believe in coincidences, someone who knows that ghosts don't rest without a reason." For the first time in weeks, Mateo put the newspaper on the table and straightened up. "You didn't come for coffee, did you?" "No, Mr. Acosta. I came for answers, and if I don't get them, I'm afraid others will come looking for them." Mateo held his gaze. Vega didn't blink. "Then you've come to the right place. But I'll warn you something. Whoever plays with the desert ends up losing more than sand between their fingers." That night, as Vega returned to his temporary lodging, 2 motorcycles followed him from a distance. They weren't Mateo's men, they were from a rival group that had also received the rumor that the old Hitman was still alive. And in the world of the living dead, secrets are worth more than blood. Mateo, in his cabin, loaded an old M1911 pistol. He cleaned each piece like a sacred rite. Then he opened a secret compartment in the floor of the living room. Inside, there was a metal briefcase closed with a steel chain and 3 numerical locks. He dialed the codes. Inside lay documents, fake passports, aged dollars, and a small wooden box with a cross engraved on it. He opened it carefully. It contained an oxidized military medal and a letter sealed with red wax. Matteo took a deep breath. The past was calling again, and this time it wasn't coming alone. He knew he couldn't face it completely alone, and for the first time in many years, he thought about seeking help. Dawn filtered through the desert mountains like a golden knife. Matteo's cabin remained silent, but inside something moved with determination. The old man had already packed the essentials: the metal briefcase, a couple of changes of clothes, his military knife and an old tactical frequency radio. He knew that the time to react was running out. It wasn't enough to resist. It was time to prepare to attack. As he tied the saddlebags to the Harley, his mind traveled decades back to a humid and dense jungle, where he learned that the only way to survive was to trust the few who knew how to remain invisible. He thought of Ramiro, his former operations partner in Colombia, who supposedly died in an undercover mission. But Matteo knew that Ramiro wasn't dead. He had just sunk into anonymity like him. He took out his secret contact book, a piece of laminated paper hidden in the bottom of his boot, and dialed a number in an oxidized telephone booth 2 kilometers from the restaurant. 3 tones. Then a hoarse voice answered. "Who's speaking?" "The one who returned from the dust," said Matteo. There was a long silence on the other side. Finally, the voice replied, "Where are you?" "Where the sun burns slow and the dogs no longer bark. I'll be there in 36 hours. Matteo hung up. Nothing more was needed. Meanwhile, Vega was advancing with his own strategy. He wasn't a common hitman. He was trained in military intelligence techniques, infiltration, and psychological tracking. He knew the behavior patterns of men like Matteo, and the most dangerous thing, he knew there was no way to scare them. That's why he changed tactics. Instead of looking for him directly, he began to put pressure on those around him. He visited the owner of the store where Matteo bought supplies. He threatened him subtly, leaving a bullet on the counter. Then he intercepted the waitress from El Ultimo Refugio when she left work. "Do you work for him?" he asked, leaning against his car without raising his voice. "For who?" "For the old man who sits at the back table every Wednesday." "I don't even know his name," she lied, her heart beating like a broken drum. Vega looked at her with his empty eyes and then smiled with an almost human gesture. "Well, it's better if it stays that way." That same night, Matteo returned to the restaurant for the last time. Not to eat, just to leave a note hidden under the sugar jar. "If they look for me, say I left. If they ask, say I'm dead. Don't talk. Not a word. Not for me. For you." The waitress found the message the next day. She read it in silence and burned it immediately, without telling anyone. Something inside her, an instinct that came from the stories her grandfather used to tell about the war, told her that this man was not a simple stranger, and that the danger had only just begun. 36 hours later, an oxidized military vehicle without visible insignia appeared on the old road. Ramiro descended. He had a graying beard, a prosthesis on his right leg, and a blind eye. But his bearing remained intact. "I thought you'd be older," he said, hugging Matteo with one arm. "I thought you'd be dead." "Maybe I am, but I was curious to see why the Phantom needed me." Matteo explained everything to him: the cartel men, Vega, the photo, the intercepted message. Ramiro listened without interrupting. "If they're sending Vega, it's not for revenge. It's for cleanup. They want your story to disappear, but there's a way to bury them first." "Which one?" "We give them a reason to be afraid of us again." That same night, in the cabin, they began to draw up a plan. A surgical strike, a clear message. It was no longer about defending themselves, it was a warning. The strategy was underway, like in the old days. Every movement measured, every step covered. Like in the jungle, like in the war. Because when 2 ghosts decide to leave the tomb, even the demons tremble. The sun had not yet risen when Matteo and Ramiro went out into the desert. The Harley roared like an old but alive beast, while Ramiro's military vehicle advanced behind, covered with tarpaulins and tools that looked like scrap, but they weren't. Under the rusted metal and the broken bags, they carried what was needed to ignite a hell, It wasn't an improvised mission, it was the return of two shadows with a purpose, and every step they took was calculated, as if they were following a choreography that only they knew. They had chosen the target carefully, a surveillance post used by Vega's cell, located in an area without clear jurisdiction, halfway between the border and the old mining route. According to the information that Ramiro had collected, the organization's liaisons met there, stored packages for distribution, and above all tracked suspicious movements in the region. If they destroyed that point, they would send an unequivocal message. "Are you sure about this?" Ramiro asked as he checked the homemade explosive charge. "I didn't come to the desert to die in my sleep," Mateo replied. "I came to decide when to close my eyes." Both looked at each other with respect. They were no longer soldiers, they were walking scars. The night fell like a curtain of dark velvet. At the surveillance post, 4 cartel men played cards while one watched the radar and another slept on a dirty mattress. They didn't know they were in the crosshairs. They didn't know that history doesn't always forgive the distracted. Mateo watched from a distance, leaning behind a rock. Ramiro prepared the remote detonator. "In 3 minutes, turn off the generator light. In 5, we release smoke. And then the wolves come," Mateo completed. The plan was executed with surgical precision. First, total darkness. Then, smoke gas filling the main room. The guards came out confused, coughing and shooting into the air. And then, as if the desert opened its mouth, the accurate shots began. Ramiro, with his precision undiminished despite his blind eye, took down the first 2. Mateo infiltrated quickly, disarmed the third, and used his own gun against the 4th. The last one fell as he tried to flee. There was no mercy, no screams, only heavy breathing and the echo of the past taking shape once more. In the center of the compound, they found documents, cell phones, coordinates. Everything was incinerated, except for one folder. It contained a list of names. On it, underlined in red, was the alias Mateo thought he'd buried. Ghost. "They're hunting us," Ramiro said without looking up. This wasn't a message, it was a warning. They know you're alive and that you're not alone. Mateo pocketed the folder. "Then we'll make them wish they hadn't found out." Before leaving, they placed the main charge in the armory. Once they were far enough away, Ramiro pressed the detonator. The explosion lit up the sky like lightning. Fire devoured everything. The flames danced on the horizon as if hell itself was celebrating its return. That dawn, Vega received an encrypted call. The outpost fell. We lost men, materials, and they found the ghost's mark. The man didn't respond immediately. He closed his eyes. He clenched his jaw. Then he said, "Prepare everything, we're going after him." But inside Vega, something stirred. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Respect, or perhaps the realization that the game had changed. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Mateo and Ramiro drank coffee in silence. "What's next?" Ramiro asked, his voice hoarse. "The past. Bury it or let it bury us, but not here." Mateo stood up and looked at the horizon. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and memory. He knew the real battle was close, and when it came, there would be no room for error, because wolves, once awakened, do not go back to sleep. The night was thick, denser than usual. The sky, usually clear in the desert, was covered by low clouds that seemed to foreshadow a storm. But the real tempest was brewing on the ground. Mateo and Ramiro had moved to a hill near Guadalupe Canyon, a desolate place they used as an escape route in their days of clandestine operations. There, with a panoramic view and multiple escape routes, they decided to await Vega's move. They knew he would come, and he wouldn't come alone. From a private plane, Vega descended on a clandestine runway at dusk. He was accompanied by 4 trained, silent, and disciplined men. They weren't hitmen. They were professional killers, ex-military men who had fallen from grace and found refuge in the darkness of dirty money. They carried tactical backpacks, rifles with thermal scopes, and coded communications. They didn't talk to each other. They only obeyed. The objective was clear: eliminate Mateo Acosta and anyone else with him. "Leave no traces," Vega ordered as he adjusted his watch. "Don't shoot unless necessary. I want to look the ghost in the eyes when we erase him from the map." Hours later, on the hill, Matteo watched with infrared binoculars. The dust raised by the armored vehicles on the road from the east confirmed his suspicions. "They're coming," he murmured, "with everything." Ramiro nodded. He had placed traps around the perimeter, small buried mines, flares that would betray the enemy's passage, and a fire line at the bottom of the canyon that would serve as a last defense. "If they cross that line, there's no turning back," he said, his voice grave. Matteo checked his pistol, the same M1911 he had carried in every war, and kissed it gently as if it were a talisman. "There's no turning back anyway." The first explosion shook the earth at 2:43 a.m. One of the improvised mines exploded as one of the infiltrators passed. Screams mingled with gunfire. Infrared lights revealed silhouettes approaching, crawling on the ground like shadows with claws. Matteo fired first. A dry shot. Precise. One went down. Ramiro covered the right flank, using the rocky terrain as an advantage. The flares ignited and the sky turned red, illuminating the scene like a war ritual. Vega, hidden behind a thick bush, watched coldly. His men were falling, fast, too fast. "Don't underestimate that old man," he whispered into the communicator. "Don't get distracted." One of the infiltrators managed to circle the hill. Matteo felt it. He left his position, turned down a hidden path among the bushes and intercepted him head-on. There was no time for words, only knives. The enemy lunged, but Matteo deflected the arm with his left forearm and plunged the blade into his neck. All in 2 seconds. He returned to his position with a racing pulse, the enemy's blood still warm on his hand. Ramiro was still firing from a crack. Another attacker fell, but a bullet grazed his left arm, making him recoil. "I'm fine," he shouted. "Just a scratch." Matteo knew they couldn't resist much longer. There were only 2 of them, and Vega hadn't appeared yet. That was the most dangerous thing, his silence. Then he saw him. Vega emerged from the south, alone, walking among the shadows. He carried no visible weapons, only a long knife and his hollow eyes like 2 open graves. "Matteo Acosta," he shouted from the plane. "Come out of your hole. I didn't come for your bones. I came for your name." Matteo stood up, exposed. He slowly descended the hill without fear. "You want my name?" he said in a firm voice. "Come and get it." Ramiro from above raised his sights, but Matteo raised his hand. "Don't shoot." The confrontation finally was face to face. 2 men, 2 pasts, 2 destinies crossed by war. The real clash was about to begin. The desert wind whistled among the stones like a snake that foreshadowed death. Face to face, Matteo and Vega remained motionless. One with the wisdom of time and the memory of many wars, the other with the arrogance of absolute control and the hunger to erase what he could not dominate. Vega took the first step. "Do you think that because you killed a few stray dogs you've already won this war?" he said, slowly twirling the knife between his fingers. "You are history. I am the present. History is the only thing that can't be erased with blood," Matteo replied calmly. Vega lunged. The knife cut through the air like lightning. Matteo dodged it by centimeters and retreated with surprising agility for his age. Both knew there would be no more words, only steel and bone. The fight was brutal, without elegant technique or choreographed movements. It was a war of instinct, of pure survival. Vega managed to slash his side with the blade. Matteo grunted but did not fall. He used his surroundings, earth, stones, even the wind. In a moment of enemy carelessness, he pushed him against a thorny cactus and disarmed him with a dry blow to the wrist. But Vega immediately counterattacked, pulling out a second blade hidden in his boot. He buried it in Matteo's shoulder. The old man fell to his knees. Blood blurred his vision. He seemed finished. "I knew you weren't immortal," Vega whispered, raising the knife. And then, the shot. Vega collapsed to the side, wounded in the leg. Ramiro, from the top of the hill, had intervened at the last second. "Get up, Matteo," he shouted. "Finish this." Matteo stood up like a twisted tree that refuses to fall. He took Vega's knife and approached, limping. Vega tried to crawl, looking for his fallen weapon, but Mateo stepped on his hand hard. "I warned you," he said, his breath ragged. "You shouldn't have awakened the dead." He pointed the blade at him. For an eternal second, everything was silent. But he didn't kill him. Instead, he cut his belt, took his radio, and threw his ID away. "You're not worth my bullet, not even my revenge." Ramiro descended slowly from the hill as Mateo staggered away. "Are you crazy?" his friend said, approaching quickly. "You could have finished him." Mateo stopped and looked at him. "That's what they do, not what we do." Hours later, Vega woke up alone, tied with duct tape to a pole in the middle of the desert. Next to him, a canteen, a compass, and a handwritten note. "Remember that the one who kills doesn't always win. Sometimes, the one who forgives wins. M.A." He screamed with rage, but he knew that no one would hear him. That defeat was worse than death. Mateo, meanwhile, received makeshift medical attention in the cabin. Ramiro bandaged his shoulder, while the old soldier slowly drank a cup of cold coffee. "You shouldn't have forgiven him," Ramiro insisted. "Yes, he deserved it, but not for him, for me. I don't want to leave this world being what I was. I want to leave as what I strive to be. A ghost who learned to live." Mateo smiled for the first time in days. Something like that. At dawn, both men sat outside, facing the desert, watching the first rays of the sun rise over the wounded sand. There was no noise, no threats, only wind and light. "What now?" Ramiro asked. Mateo replied with a deep calm. "Now we rest, until the world needs us again." Silence was their answer. But in that silence hid the certainty that they had won, not only the enemy, but also the ghosts of the past. The following days were quiet. The desert, as if it had witnessed something sacred, returned to its usual state of immense silence and deceptive calm. Mateo and Ramiro, although injured, walked every morning to the hill where they sat to contemplate the horizon. Neither said much. They had already said everything with their actions. The cabin was more reinforced. The papers, the maps, the weapons, everything was buried or burned. They didn't want to leave traces. The war had ended for them, at least for now. Mateo returned to his table at the last refuge. He no longer arrived alone. Ramiro accompanied him sometimes, and the waitress greeted him with a respect that needed no words. But although the immediate danger had passed, they knew that shadows do not disappear. They only wait. Vega was still alive. The cartel too. And the name Ghost had returned to circulate among whispers and rumors. Mateo no longer sought peace. He had found it. Not because the world changed, but because he had changed. He had won without killing. He had faced the enemy without becoming one. And if the past returned, he would be ready. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of honor, of silence, of the battles that are never forgotten, then stay with us, because there are still stories to tell of those who fight in the shadows. Of those whom no one remembers anymore, but who still walk among us. Subscribe and activate the bell, because the next time someone makes fun of an old man at a truck stop, it could be their last mistake.